The wind swept across the plain, carrying dust in swirling clouds that danced like ghosts under a blood-red sunset. The horizon swallowed the sun, painting the cracked earth in shades of crimson and shadow, where sagebrush trembled in the fading light. A lone cabin stood defiant at the edge of a dry creek, its weathered boards bleached gray, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Inside, a man sat motionless, his calloused hands cradling a tin mug of cold coffee, his gaze lost in the floorboards where memories lingered like faint echoes. Caleb hadn't stirred for hours. His eyes, once sharp and alive, now dulled by grief, traced the worn wood, seeing only fragments of Lila. Her soft laughter as she mended his shirts, the way her hair caught the firelight, her voice humming a tune he could no longer recall. She was gone now, taken by fever 3 winters ago, her name etched on a stone by the creek, worn smooth by time and wind. The saddle by the door gathered dust, its leather strap torn, a silent reminder of rides he no longer took. He lacked the will to mend it, or much else, letting the cabin and his heart fall into quiet ruin. A knock broke the stillness, soft at first, then firmer, pulling Caleb from his thoughts. His hand reached for the rifle propped by his chair, a reflex born of living in a land where strangers often brought trouble. He rose, his boots heavy on the creaking floor, and eased the door open, letting the dusk's fading light spill across the threshold. A young woman stood before him, her face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Her brown dress, patched but neatly stitched, hung loose on her slight frame, and a worn leather satchel rested over her shoulder. Behind her, a mule stood weary, favoring one leg, its breath steaming in the cooling air. Her green eyes met his, calm but guarded, holding a quiet strength that made him pause. "I need shelter," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who'd faced worse than a closed door. "My mule's injured. I won't reach town before dark." Caleb studied her, his grip on the rifle loosening. "This isn't a place for travelers." She didn't flinch. Her hand reached into her satchel, pulling out a glinting needle threaded with coarse twine. "I mend things. Leather, cloth, whatever's broken. I can earn my keep." His gaze drifted to the saddle by the door, its torn strap mocking his inaction. The wind stirred, rattling the windows, and he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Barn's out back. Your mule can rest there." She nodded once, her expression unreadable, and led the mule toward the barn, her silhouette blending into the twilight. Caleb watched her go, a faint stir in his chest, like an ember struggling to catch. He closed the door, the cabin settling back into silence. But it felt different now, less heavy, as if her presence had shifted the air. Dawn broke cold. The sky streaked with bruised purple and gold, casting long shadows across the plain. Caleb woke to the sound of rhythmic hammering, soft but steady, coming from the corral. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, the air sharp against his face. The woman stood by the fence, nailing a loose board into place, her movements sure and practiced. The mule grazed nearby, its leg wrapped in clean cloth, no longer limping. She glanced up, meeting his eyes, her green gaze clear and unflinching. "Fence was falling apart," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet confidence. "I fixed it." Caleb nodded, his throat tight with something he couldn't name. He turned to the woodpile, hefting his axe, and began splitting logs, the familiar rhythm grounding him. The steady chop filled the morning, blending with the soft clink of her hammer. She worked through the day, her needle flashing as she mended a tear in his jacket hanging by the door. By noon, he found the jacket on its hook, the stitches so neat they seemed part of the fabric itself. He ran his fingers over the thread, his brow furrowing, and left a piece of bread on the barn step for her, saying nothing. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. She rose with the sun, her hands never idle, patching the barn roof, reinforcing the corral gate, stitching a torn blanket. Caleb hunted rabbits, split wood, and left portions of meat outside her door, their exchanges wordless but deliberate. Their paths crossed at twilight by the creek, their shadows mingling briefly before parting, like a dance neither acknowledged. One evening, She sat by a small fire outside the barn, mending a bridle with careful stitches, the firelight casting soft shadows across her face. Caleb approached, his hands empty, and sat across from her, the warmth of the flames easing the chill in his bones. She began to hum, a gentle melody that wove through the crackling fire, warm and unfamiliar, stirring memories he thought he'd lost. He closed his eyes, letting the sound settle over him, soft as a blanket. The saddle remained untouched, its strap still broken, a quiet challenge by the door. The first frost came early, silvering the grass and hardening the earth. She worked harder, her breath visible as she tightened wire around a fence post, her fingers reddened by the cold. Caleb found her at dawn, shivering but determined, her hat dusted with frost. He draped a wool blanket over her shoulders, his hands lingering a moment longer than needed. She paused, her eyes meeting his, then nodded once, her gaze softening. He turned away, his boots crunching back to the cabin, the weight in his chest shifting. That night, a pair of leather gloves appeared on his porch, hand-stitched, the seams strong and even. He slipped them on, the warmth sinking into his palms, and glanced at the barn, where a faint light glowed through the cracks. His heart stirred, a quiet ache, not of loss, but of something new. The next morning, he carried the saddle to the porch, setting it in the pale sunlight. He stared at the torn strap, his jaw set, and picked up a knife, trying to cut a new piece of leather. His hands shook, the blade slipping, and he cursed under his breath. Her shadow fell across the saddle, steady and calm. She stepped closer, her presence like a warm hearth. "Let me," she said softly, taking the knife from his hand. Caleb stepped back, watching as her fingers worked, the needle gliding through the leather with precision. She finished, smoothing the strap, and handed the saddle back, their hands brushing, warm and brief. He swallowed, nodded, and she offered a faint smile, her eyes holding his a moment longer before she returned to the barn. Winter loomed closer, its chill settling into the plain. She packed her satchel, her work nearly done, the mule healed, the barn fortified, the corral strong. She stood by the fence, hat in hand, her ribbon loose in her hair, the morning light catching her face. Caleb watched from the porch, the saddle at his feet, its strap whole, a quiet testament to her care. She turned to leave, her mule ready, her steps slow. She paused, looked back, her green eyes steady and deep. Caleb stepped forward, his boots soft on the earth, and held out a small wooden carving, a bird, rough but clear, its wings spread as if ready to fly. She took it, her fingers tracing the edges, her gaze softening. "Stay," he said, his voice rough but warm, carrying a hope he hadn't felt in years. She glanced at the cabin, the creek, the stone with Lila's name, then back at him. She nodded once, slow and sure, her smile faint but real. The wind fell silent, and the plain waited for spring. Frost crept over the plain, silvering the sagebrush and hardening the earth beneath a pale, early morning sky. The cabin stood quiet, its chimney trailing a thin wisp of smoke into the cold air, blending with the dawn's soft glow. The corral gate, newly mended, gleamed with fresh nails, and the mule grazed contentedly nearby, its leg wrapped in clean cloth, moving freely now. Caleb woke to the faint clink of a hammer, a steady rhythm that pulled him from restless dreams of Lila's laughter and the open road they'd once ridden together. He pulled on his jacket, the stitched seams a quiet reminder of the woman's presence, and stepped onto the porch, where the air stung his face. She was by the barn, reinforcing a loose board, her movements sure and practiced, her wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across her face. She glanced up, her green eyes meeting his, clear and unflinching, holding a strength that made him pause. Without a word, she returned to her work, the hammer's soft beat blending with the morning stillness. Caleb crossed to the woodpile, hefting his axe, and began splitting logs, each swing grounding him in the familiar rhythm. He stole glances at her, noting the way her hands moved with purpose, the faint hum of a melody on her lips, soft as the wind through the creek's cottonwoods. The gloves she'd made warmed his hands, their seams a silent promise, and he wondered again who she was, what had brought her to his doorstep. By noon, she was mending a harness, her needle flashing in the sunlight as she sat on a stump by the barn. Caleb brought her a tin of water, setting it beside her without speaking, and she nodded, her ribbon catching the breeze as she drank deeply, her throat moving in the soft light. Their eyes met briefly, a quiet understanding passing between them, fragile but growing. A rustle broke the moment, sharp and sudden, from the sagebrush beyond the corral. A small figure darted out, a boy, no older than 10, his clothes ragged, face smudged with dirt, clutching a stolen apple. He froze under Caleb's gaze, eyes wide with fear, ready to bolt. The woman lowered her needle, her expression calm but steady, and raised a hand, slow and gentle. "Don't run," she said, her voice soft as a lullaby, carrying a warmth that eased the boy's tension. He hesitated, his shoulders hunched, then stepped closer, his eyes flicking between her and Caleb. She reached into her satchel, pulling out a piece of bread, and held it out, her movements deliberate, like an offering. The boy took it, devouring it in quick, hungry bites, his hands trembling. Caleb stood still, his axe resting against the woodpile, his chest tightening as he watched. The boy's small frame, his wary eyes, stirred memories of Lila, of the child they dreamed of but never held. He turned away, his jaw set, and resumed chopping, the blade biting deeper than needed. Night fell with a storm rolling in, the wind rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow swirling across the plain. Caleb opened the door to find the woman and the boy on the porch, soaked and shivering, her arm around his shoulders. The boy's eyes were wide, his hands clutching her sleeve. And she looked at Caleb, her gaze a quiet plea in the flickering lantern light. He stepped aside, letting them in, and the cabin's warmth enveloped them, chasing away the chill. The boy huddled by the fire, and she draped a blanket over him, her hands steady despite the cold clinging to her dress. Caleb stoked the flames, the fire's crackle filling the silence, and watched as she knelt beside the boy, brushing wet hair from his face. "Who is he?" Caleb asked, his voice low, the words heavy with curiosity and something softer. She paused, her hands stilling on the blanket. "Thomas," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Found him by the creek, hiding in the brush. He's got no one else." Caleb nodded, his eyes drifting to the boy, then to the stone by the creek in his mind. Lila's name worn by time. The weight of it felt different now, shared somehow by the two figures before him. He turned to the window, watching the storm's fury, his thoughts tangled with questions he wasn't ready to ask. Morning brought a thin layer of snow, blanketing the plain in silence. The woman and Thomas worked together by the corral, clearing frost from the gate. She showed him how to tighten a hinge, guiding his small hands with patience, and he mimicked her, clumsy but earnest, his face brightening when she nodded approval. Their laughter, soft and fleeting, carried to Caleb on the porch, where he stood with his coffee tin, the warmth seeping through his gloves. He watched her, the way she moved with the boy. Careful, protective, like she was mending more than wood or leather. His gaze drifted to the saddle by the door, its strap whole now, a quiet testament to her skill. He stepped forward, boots crunching snow, and handed Thomas a small knife, its handle worn but solid. "For carving," he said, his voice gruff but warm. Thomas's eyes widened, and he took it, gripping it tightly, a spark of pride in his gaze. The woman looked up, her ribbon loose in her hair, and offered a small smile that warmed the air between them. Caleb turned back to the cabin, his heart heavier but not with grief, the stir of something new taking root. The snow fell softly, and the plain held its breath, waiting. Snow deepened across the plain, softening the sharp edges of sagebrush, and wrapping the cabin in a quiet cocoon of white. The fire inside burned steady, its warm light flickering over the rough walls, casting shadows that danced with the faint howl of the wind outside. Caleb sat at the table, his knife shaping a small wooden horse, its form growing clearer with each careful stroke, though his hands moved slower now, heavy with thoughts. Thomas slept by the hearth, curled in a blanket, his small hand clutching the knife Caleb had given him, his face peaceful in the fire's glow. The woman stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the snow fall, her hands still for once, tracing the edge of her shawl with a quiet intensity. Caleb glanced at her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her green eyes searched the horizon as if expecting a shadow to emerge from the storm. He set the carving down and crossed to the fire, adding a log to keep the warmth alive, the flames flaring briefly. She turned, her gaze catching his in the soft light, and for a moment the silence between them felt alive, charged with unspoken questions. "Storm's getting worse," she said, her voice low and smooth, flowing like a river over worn stones. "We'll need more wood before it buries the pile." Caleb nodded, his eyes drifting to Thomas, the boy's small form a reminder of something he'd thought lost forever. "He's staying warm. That's a start." Her expression softened, and she followed his gaze, a faint smile touching her lips. "He's stronger than he seems. Just needs someone to see it." Her words lingered, weaving a thread of understanding between them. Caleb wanted to ask about her past, about the pain he saw in her eyes, but the silence felt safer, a fragile bridge not yet ready to bear weight. He returned to the table, picking up his knife, the soft scrape of blade on wood blending with the fire's gentle crackle, grounding him in the moment. Morning brought a brittle calm. The snow settled, but the air sharp with cold that bit at the skin. Caleb stepped outside, his axe in hand, and began splitting logs, his breath clouding in the frosty dawn, each swing a steady rhythm that kept his thoughts at bay. The woman and Thomas emerged, bundled against the chill, and headed to the corral, where frost clung to the gate. She showed the boy how to check the hinges, guiding his small hands as he tightened a loose nail with care, his face brightening when she nodded approval. Their laughter, soft and fleeting, carried across the plain, a sound that made Caleb pause, his axe hovering mid-swing, his chest tightening with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He glanced at the creek, where Lila's stone stood half-buried in snow, its weight lighter now, as if the woman's presence and Thomas's small steps were sharing its burden. He shook his head, refocusing on the wood, but the thought lingered, stubborn as the frost. Hoofbeats broke the stillness, growing louder through the morning mist, a low rumble that set Caleb's nerves on edge. He straightened, his hand moving to the rifle propped against the woodpile, his eyes narrowing as 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their shapes dark against the white plain. The lead rider, a broad man in a fur-lined coat, raised a hand, slowing his companions, their horses snorting clouds of steam. Caleb stepped forward, his stance firm, the rifle close but not raised, his heart steady but alert. The woman noticed, her hands stilling as she pulled Thomas behind her, her body a quiet shield. The boy's eyes widened, but he stayed silent, gripping her sleeve tightly. The lead rider reined in his horse, his face weathered, eyes narrow with suspicion. "Looking for a runaway boy," he said, his voice rough as gravel cutting through the cold. "Stole from the trader in town. Heard he's hiding out here." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle, his voice calm but unyielding. "No boy here. You're on my land. Move on." The rider's gaze flicked to the cabin, then to the woman and Thomas by the corral, his lips curling into a smirk. "Heard different. Folks saw a kid heading this way." The woman stepped forward, her chin raised, her voice steady and clear, like a blade wrapped in silk. "You heard wrong. There's no one here but us." The rider chewed tobacco, spitting into the snow, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long. "We'll see about that." He nodded to the others who dismounted, their hands resting on holsters, their steps deliberate. Caleb raised his rifle, not aiming but ready, his voice low and firm. "I said move on." The rider held his stare, then smirked again, mounting his horse with a slow, deliberate motion. "We'll be back," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. The group turned, their hoofbeats fading into the mist, leaving only silence and the faint crunch of snow. Inside, the fire burned low, the air thick with unspoken tension. Thomas sat by the hearth, his knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the flames, his small hands trembling slightly. The woman knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her touch steady and reassuring. "They're gone," she said softly, her voice a quiet anchor, You're safe here. Caleb stood by the door, rifle still in hand, watching the horizon through the frosted window. They'll come again, he said, his voice low, more to himself than to her, the weight of the words settling in his chest. She rose, crossing to the table where his carving lay, her fingers brushing the wooden horse, its shape nearly complete. Then we'll be ready, she said, her eyes meeting his, steady and unafraid, a spark of resolve in their depths. He nodded, his jaw tight, and sat beside Thomas, the boy leaning slightly toward him, seeking warmth. She returned to her mending, her needle flashing as she repaired a torn blanket, her soft hum filling the room, weaving through the silence like a thread binding them together. Name's Lydia, she said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear, as if offering a piece of herself. Thought you should know. Caleb looked at her, the name settling into him like a stone in still water. Lydia, he repeated, testing its weight, his voice softer than he intended. She smiled, faint but real, and the cabin felt warmer, despite the snow falling thicker outside, blanketing the plain in quiet promise. The storm passed in the night, leaving the plain buried under a thick blanket of snow, the sky a pale gray that promised more to come. The cabin stood defiant against the cold, its chimney smoke curling into the still air, a thin thread of warmth in the frozen world. Caleb rose early, his breath visible as he stoked the fire, the embers flaring to life with a soft crackle. Thomas still slept by the hearth, his small form cocooned in the blanket, his face peaceful, untouched by the tension that hung in the air. Lydia was already up, standing by the window, her hands kneading dough for bread, her movements slow and deliberate, her green eyes distant. Caleb watched her, noting the faint lines of worry etched around her mouth, the way her gaze kept drifting to the horizon, as if the rider's threat lingered like a shadow just out of sight. He wanted to ask about her past, about the pain she carried, but the words stuck in his throat, heavy and unformed. He stepped outside, the cold biting his face, and crossed to the barn, where the mule stamped its hooves, restless in the chill. The saddle hung on the wall, its strap whole now, a quiet testament to Lydia's skill. He ran his fingers over the stitches, fine and strong, and felt a stir in his chest, a warmth that had been absent for too long. Back inside, the dough rested under a cloth, and Lydia was sweeping the floor, her strokes brisk, her ribbon loose in her hair. Thomas stirred, blinking awake, and she paused, setting the broom aside to kneel beside him. Hungry? She asked, her voice soft, a gentle anchor in the quiet room. Thomas nodded, rubbing his eyes, and she fetched a bowl of stew, warming it over the fire before handing it to him. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold, a strange sense of belonging settling over him, fragile but real. The boy ate quickly, then looked up at Lydia, his eyes bright with curiosity. You got a name? She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of her shawl, then smiled faintly. Lydia, she said, the words slipping out like a secret shared. Thomas tilted his head, considering. I like it. Sounds kind. Caleb's gaze snapped to her, the name settling into him like a missing piece. Lydia. It fit her. Simple, steady, with a quiet strength that matched her hands and her heart. She avoided his eyes, turning back to the fire, but the air between them had shifted, charged with something new. The day stretched on, slow and quiet, the snow outside muffling the world. Caleb chopped wood, his axe biting deep into the logs, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Lydia and Thomas stayed inside, their voices a low murmur through the walls, her teaching him to knead dough, his small laugh breaking the stillness like a ray of light. By afternoon, the sky darkened again, heavy with the promise of more snow. Caleb returned, arms laden with firewood, and found them by the hearth. Lydia sat cross-legged, mending a tear in Thomas's sleeve, while the boy watched, rapt, as her needle danced through the fabric. You're good at that, Thomas said, awe in his voice. She shrugged, her eyes on her work. Had to be. Caleb dropped the wood by the fire, his gaze lingering on her. Where'd you learn? Her hands stilled, the needle poised mid-stitch, and for a moment, the only sound was the fire's crackle. Then softly, "A long time ago. Someone taught me." "Who?" Thomas asked, innocent and curious. Her jaw tightened, and she resumed stitching, faster now, her voice flat. "Doesn't matter." Caleb frowned, sensing the wall she'd thrown up, the pain behind it. He wanted to press, to understand, but the boy's presence held him back. Instead, he sat across from them, pulling a knife and a block of wood from his pocket, and began carving, the blade shaving curls of pine, his hands steady, but his mind restless. Night fell hard, the wind rising again, rattling the windows with a fury that made the cabin feel small. They ate bread and stew in silence, the firelight flickering across their faces, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Thomas yawned, curling up by the hearth, and soon his breathing deepened into sleep. Lydia rose to clear the table, but Caleb caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm. "Wait." She froze, her eyes meeting his, wary and searching, the tension between them palpable. He let go, stepping back, but the question burned in his throat, insistent. "What are you running from?" Her breath hitched, barely audible, and she set the bowl down, her hands trembling slightly. "What makes you think I'm running?" "You stayed," he said, his voice low, echoing her words from days before. "But not just because I asked. There's more." She turned away, staring into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things, and then, in a voice so low he almost missed it. "I had a brother once. Younger, like Thomas. He didn't make it." Caleb's chest tightened, the weight of her words settling over him. He saw it now, the shadow in her gaze, the way she looked at the boy, protective and pained. "What happened?" "Fever took him," she said, her tone flat, final, like a door closing. "I couldn't fix it. Couldn't fix anything." He stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire on her skin. "You're fixing things now," he said, his voice rough but sincere, carrying a truth he hadn't realized until that moment. She looked at him then, her gaze raw, unguarded, and for a heartbeat, the storm outside faded, leaving only the two of them in the quiet light. "Am I?" she whispered, the question hanging between them. He didn't answer, couldn't, but he reached out, his hand brushing hers, rough fingers against smooth, and she didn't pull away. They stood there, the fire crackling softly, the wind's howl distant, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt the ice in his heart begin to thaw. Later, as the storm raged on, Caleb lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled with the woman beside him. Not in body, but in spirit. Lydia slept near Thomas, her arm draped protectively over the boy. Her face softened in sleep. The cabin felt smaller, the air charged with trust, or perhaps the promise of it. Outside, the snow fell thicker, burying the past a little deeper, and Caleb closed his eyes, letting the sound of the fire lull him into a restless sleep. Snow fell heavy across the plain, burying the sagebrush and sealing the cabin in a world of white silence. The fire inside burned low, its embers casting a faint glow over the rough walls, where shadows flickered with the wind's restless howl. Caleb stood by the window, his rifle in hand, watching the horizon through the frosted glass, his breath steady, but his heart alert. Thomas slept by the hearth, curled in a blanket, his small face peaceful, unaware of the tension that gripped the room. Lydia sat at the table, her needle flashing as she mended a torn coat, her green eyes sharp, her movements deliberate, as if stitching could hold the world together. The writer's threat hung over them, a shadow that refused to fade. Caleb had seen their tracks in the snow at dawn, circling closer, and he knew they'd return, driven by greed or vengeance. He glanced at Lydia, her face lit by the fire, and felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. She'd mended more than his saddle. Her presence had stitched together the broken pieces of his life, and he'd fight to protect what they'd built. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, steady and unafraid, as if she sensed his thoughts. "They're coming," she said, her voice low and smooth, like a river flowing through stone. "I saw the tracks too." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight, and moved to the door, checking the bar across it. "Stay with Thomas. Keep him low." She rose, setting her needle down, and crossed to the hearth, her hand brushing Thomas's shoulder as she knelt beside him. "We'll be ready," she said, her eyes holding his, a spark of trust binding them in the quiet. Dusk brought hoofbeats, loud and deliberate, cutting through the storm's howl. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle raised, his boots crunching snow as he faced the darkness. 4 riders emerged from the mist, their lanterns casting harsh light across the plain, their horses snorting steam. The lead rider, his fur-lined coat dusted with snow, reined in, his smirk visible in the flickering glow. "No more games," he called, his voice rough and cold. "Hand over the boy, or we burn this place down." Caleb's grip tightened, his voice steady as iron. "You're on my land. Leave now, or you won't leave at all." The rider laughed, a harsh sound swallowed by the wind, and nodded to his men, who dismounted, hands on their guns. Caleb fired a warning shot into the snow, the crack echoing across the plain, and the riders froze, their eyes narrowing. Lydia appeared in the doorway, a pistol in her hand, her stance firm beside Caleb. "He's not yours to take," she said, her voice clear and unyielding, cutting through the cold like a blade. The lead rider spat, his gaze shifting between them, calculating. "You're outnumbered," he sneered, drawing his revolver. A shot rang out, sharp and sudden, and the rider's horse reared, throwing him into the snow. Caleb fired again, catching another man's shoulder, and Lydia's pistol barked, sending a third scrambling for cover. The 4th rider hesitated, then bolted, his horse vanishing into the storm. Caleb advanced, rifle trained on the lead rider who groaned in the snow, clutching his leg. "Get off my land," he said, his voice low and final. The rider glared but nodded, crawling to his horse, his men limping behind. They rode off, their lanterns fading into the white, leaving only silence and the faint smell of gunpowder. Dawn broke pale and cold, the plain glittering under fresh snow, the tracks of the riders already fading. Caleb sat on the porch, his arm bandaged where a bullet had grazed him, the pain dull but bearable. Lydia emerged, her coat dusted with frost, carrying a tin of coffee, which she handed to him, her fingers brushing his, warm and steady. She sat beside him, her breath visible, her eyes soft but searching. "They won't be back," she said, her voice quiet but certain, a promise woven into the morning light. Caleb nodded, his gaze drifting to the creek, where Lila's stone stood clear of snow, its weight shared now by the life they'd built. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the wooden horse, its form complete, and handed it to Thomas, who ran out, his laughter breaking the stillness. The boy took it, his eyes wide with joy, and hugged Caleb, brief but fierce. Lydia smiled, her ribbon loose in her hair, and Caleb felt the ice in his heart melt fully, replaced by a warmth that felt like home. He turned to her, his voice rough but clear. "You mended more than my saddle." Her eyes held his, bright and unguarded, and she leaned closer, her hand resting on his. "And you gave me a place to stay," she said, her voice soft, carrying a truth that bound them. Spring crept in, slow and tentative, the plains softening as snow melted into rivulets that fed the creek. The cabin stood stronger, its walls patched, a small garden blooming by the door, where Lydia and Thomas planted seeds, their hands working together in the earth. Caleb saddled his horse, the strap holding firm, and rode out to check the fence, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Lydia stood by the corral, her hat in hand, watching him return, her smile a quiet promise. Thomas ran to her, holding a carved bird, a gift from Caleb, and she laughed, the sound weaving through the air like her hum by the fire. That night, they sat by the creek, the stone with Lila's name glowing in the moonlight, joined by new carvings, a horse, a bird, a leaf. Caleb took Lydia's hand, their fingers entwining, and Thomas leaned against them, his small form a bridge between past and future. The plain stretched wide, alive with possibility, and the cabin stood as a beacon of what they'd built, not just a home, but a family, stitched together by quiet love and shared scars.